It's Friday, August 23rd, 2024. We are 73 days away from the election. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, Kamala Harris accepts her nomination from the Democratic Party and becomes the first black woman to lead a major U.S. party's ticket. Also, I'm recording this at about 2:15 in the morning because I wanted to wait until after Harris was done speaking at the convention was over to start recording, so if I sound a little quieter than normal and things look a little darker than normal, it's because my wife is trying to sleep in the room behind this wall. But first, here are your headlines. On Sunday, legendary talk show host Phil Donahue passed away at his home in New York. Donahue reinvented daytime talk shows in the 1970s and 80s by interviewing outrageous guests and interacting with the audience, which no one had ever done before, and being unafraid to tackle hot-button issues like abortion and the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. His show was syndicated for nearly 3 decades, and he earned the title of King of Daytime TV. He tried to reboot his show on MSNBC in 2002, but it was canceled shortly afterwards. The network said that his ratings were tanking, but Donahue was also vehemently anti-war and maintained until his death that his show was canceled there because of his opposition to the looming Iraq War. Donahue was 88 years old. On Monday, federal agencies said it was Iran that hacked into the Trump campaign earlier this month and attempted to hack into the Harris campaign as well. The joint statement from the FBI and U.S. intelligence agencies said one of Trump's top informal advisors, Susie Wiles, was the person who was hacked in their campaign. The agencies also said it was clear that Iran sees the U.S. presidential campaign as consequential for its own interests and wants to shape the next presidency. So far, it's unclear what, if any, information was stolen through their hacking attempts. Also on Monday, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said a ceasefire deal was close between Israel and Hamas as the fighting in Gaza continues. President Biden spoke personally with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, telling him a deal was urgent, and then on Thursday, Israeli negotiators arrived in Cairo, where the U.S. ambassador there said a deal was in sight. Now, as that was happening, Israel launched several more bombing raids in the middle of the night on Thursday, bombing an area of Gaza after giving a last-minute evacuation order. The raid killed 47 civilians. On Wednesday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics announced that it was revising the jobs numbers between late last year and March of this year, finding that it had overestimated job growth by a total of about 820,000 jobs. Revisions are common, and the Bureau does them annually. Tracking unemployment numbers and tracking employment numbers in general is not exactly always an exact science, but this revision is the largest one since 2019 by about 400,000 more jobs since then, and it's about 5 times larger than the average revision. It was also a blow to the Biden administration, which had been pointing to these jobs numbers as a sign of healthy job growth and a healthy labor market and a steadily healing economy. Finally, on Tuesday, the Federal Trade Commission said companies, for the most part, are not allowed to prevent employees from going to work at rival companies through policies known as non-compete clauses. The commission said the move will help spur growth and create competition in industries. Currently, around 30 million Americans are subject to non-compete clauses in a wide range of industries. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a business organization, not a U.S. agency, called the decision an unlawful power grab and vowed to sue to block it. Okay, those are the headlines. Let's move on to the main story this week. Harris makes history. The final night of the DNC was last night, and Kamala Harris ceremonially accepted the nomination from her party. It was absolutely history-making. It was the most important speech she's ever given, the most important moment in her career so far, and she will forever be the first black woman to be nominated to the top of a major U.S. party ticket. Now, before I get to her speech, I want to talk about what Night 4 was all about, which the theme was For Our Future, the party signaling that all of the looking back to the past with the Clintons and the Obamas speaking and Biden's big night on Monday, that was all behind them now, and the focus needed to be looking ahead. At least that's what I took what it was supposed to mean when it was announced earlier this week. The actual program was something else. Night 4 felt way more like a conventional convention, which was such a change of tone and pace. It felt really blah for a convention that had been filled with excitement and joy and energy. Those things just weren't there in the way that they had been, and honestly, it was a little bit shocking. Largely, the evening was about defining Harris as a prosecutor and commander-in-chief specifically, but it also gave insight into her main issues, which were climate change, gun safety, and civil rights. The speakers were wide-ranging again, not as many as night 3. Things seemed to be more on the rails, likely because they didn't want to push Harris out of prime time like they had done to Biden and the Obamas in the first 2 nights. Among the speakers were Democratic favorites like Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, among many others. Now, Warren got a standing ovation and a full minute of applause that actually brought her to tears. In the climate change portion of the evening, the speakers were Representative Maxwell Frost, who was the first Gen Z member of Congress. He's from Florida and talked about seeing the effects of climate change already happening in his home state. It's one of the top issues for Gen Z voters. There were videos of workers talking about trying to beat the heat in desert states like Arizona. And then there were some testimonials from what appeared to be Gen Z-aged people about how they were putting their faith in Harris to tackle climate change. In the civil rights portion of the evening, former prosecutors that had worked with Harris talked about her commitment to upholding civil rights and upholding the law. The convention was addressed also by the Central Park Five, now called the Exonerated Five. These were the 5 men who, when they were teenagers in 1989, were wrongfully convicted of the murder of a jogger in Central Park. They spent decades in prison before they were exonerated in 2002, except for one of them who wasn't exonerated until 2022. Now, Donald Trump took out an ad in 1989, a full-page ad in the New York Times, when they were arrested, calling for them to be executed. And after they were exonerated, Trump said he stood by his ad. It's also worth pointing out that one of those men now, Yusuf Salaam, is now a New York City council member in Harlem. Now, those men were flanked by Reverend Al Sharpton, who talked about the connections of Harris's nomination to the civil rights struggle as a picture of how far things had come, but how much they needed to be protected. And then it was time for this section on gun safety, and that was the most moving piece of the night. Parents of children who were killed in Sandy Hook and Uvalde spoke. Rep. Lucy McBath, whose son was killed in what's known as the Loud Music shooting in 2012, spoke. Her son, a black 17-year-old, was shot and killed by a white 45-year-old man after an argument about loud music that McBath's son was playing from his car in a gas station parking lot. There was also a school shooting survivor who told his story about running and hiding. After that, former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords spoke alongside her husband, Senator Mark Kelly. Giffords was shot in an assassination attempt in 2011 at a meet-and-greet event while she was in her 3rd term as a Congresswoman. The shooter shot 19 people, killing 6 of them, including a 9-year-old girl. Giffords was shot in the head and has a remarkable recovery story where she had to relearn to do almost everything in her life, including relearning how to talk. Now, after she was shot, she dedicated her life to ending gun violence. I've seen her speak before, and it's clear that she'll never be able to speak again in the way that she used to, but I find her just so incredibly inspiring every time she's in front of a microphone. Now, for the most part, each of those sections of the program focused in on Harris's record as a prosecutor and how she would approach gun laws and polluters and strengthening civil rights and reproductive rights protections. But from the view of someone who's spent a life arguing on behalf of the American people as a prosecutor, it's an interesting thing to hold so tightly to because it's not her most popular part of her backstory for a lot of Democrats, but it does seem to be the way that Harris wants to be seen and has said that before in interviews, that she's steadfastly seen this as a part of herself and wants it to be a part of her political life. But after that, the air kind of went out of the place because the topics shifted. If night 3 was light on talk about the military and foreign policy, night 4 was the opposite. They leaned in hard to those things, showing Harris speaking at the West Point graduation earlier this year. People like Leon Panetta spoke. He was a former CIA director, former Secretary of Defense, former Chief of Staff. He was up on stage and talking about American security abroad. It's not that those things aren't important. It was just such a departure from previous nights and sort of a step outside of what we have been hearing lately from Democrats. Harris's sister also spoke, and so did her stepdaughter, her niece, and her goddaughter, and they really humanized Harris again, which brought some of the atmosphere of the previous 3 nights back in to the program. Now, there was also this little bit where two of Harris's youngest nieces helped the crowd learn how to pronounce her first name with the MC, Kerry Washington. Take a listen.
Thank you, ladies. Can you tell us your names?
Hello, everybody. My name's Amara. And my name is Leela, her little sister.
And what are you here to do?
To teach you how to say your auntie's name.
Okay. So how do you pronounce it?
First you say comma like a comma in a sentence. Then you say la like la 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 la.
Put it together and it's 1, 2, 3, Kamala. All right,
So just absolutely adorable, right? Those two sort of stole the show whenever they were up on stage, but that part of it was clearly meant to irk Republicans who have taken it upon themselves to mispronounce Kamala over and over again as many times as they can. Ultimately, Harris was introduced by North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper, which was weird and an outright attempt at electoral politics in a way that the rest of the convention just hadn't been. I mean, Cooper isn't exactly a household name. He has a fleeting connection to Harris because they were attorneys general at the same time. And even at the end of his speech, when he was telling people to get out and vote and get excited, he just kind of ran through a list of the swing states before saying all American people, which just felt nakedly political. But I do want to come back to that idea in just a second here. So after Cooper, Harris took the stage to a thundering amount of applause. It lasted so long, she had to try to tamp the crowd down several times, and every time she did, they just kept cheering louder. And it was a striking moment to take in, to see a black woman standing on that stage to witness American history and have a sense that its history as it's happening just doesn't really get old. Even after we've had so many history-making moments in the last 4 years, hell, even in the last 4 weeks, this one stood out. Harris started her speech by thanking her family and wishing Doug Emhoff a happy 10th anniversary together, and then talked about her childhood, the fact that her mom was an immigrant from India, who met her dad, who was an immigrant from Jamaica. She talked about being raised by mostly a single mom in Oakland and described being a young girl in black life in that city. It was a clear part of the speech to stick it to Donald Trump, who has been questioning publicly whether Harris is actually black. She is, and his attack is racist. She told the story of her friend who came to live with them after telling Harris that she was being sexually abused by her stepfather, and that was what spurred Harris to become a prosecutor. It's a story that she's told a lot in interviews and is part of her origin story as she describes it. And then she formally accepted. Here it is.
In the courtroom, I stood proudly before a judge and I said 5 words: Kamala Harris for the people. And to be clear, my entire career, I've only had one client, the people. And so, on behalf of the people, on behalf of every American, regardless of party, race, gender, or the language your grandmother speaks, on behalf of my mother and everyone who has ever set out on their own unlikely journey, on behalf of Americans like the people I grew up with, people who work hard, chase their dreams, and look out for one another, on behalf of everyone whose story could only be written in the greatest nation on earth, I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
From there, Harris laid out what she and Democrats see as the dangers of a second Trump presidency, like eliminating the Department of Education, ramming through a nationwide abortion ban, and cozying up to foreign dictators like North Korea's Kim Jong-un. And it was here that Harris did something unexpected. Now, usually these acceptance speeches are more about the big ideas, the soaring language, but Harris used it to go after policies. She promised to solve the nationwide housing shortage crisis. She promised to pass the bipartisan immigration bill that was tanked by Trump and Republicans earlier this year and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to protect and expand voting rights. She promised to have America lead the world in space exploration and artificial intelligence. She also took a turn into real foreign policy, like boots-on-the-ground stuff. She talked about meeting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky earlier in her vice presidency and being heavily involved in supporting the fight against Russia there. She went all in on the war in Gaza, too, which will be one of the most talked about lines in this speech. I pulled it so you can hear it for yourself.
President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination.
So that last bit there about Palestinian self-determination is bordering on radical, because it's just not something we hear so explicitly from U.S. officials, especially not from ones who are in or are trying to be in the Oval Office. It also drew attention to the fact that there were Palestinian-American protesters outside who were actual delegates at the DNC who had been holding a sit-in for every night of the DNC because they wanted a Palestinian speaker to get a 5-minute speaking slot at the convention, and they never got one. Now, all of this is unusual to include in a convention speech. Like I said, they're usually devoid of some of this stuff in a way, or at least in how specific she was, but her campaign clearly saw this as the way for Harris to lay out her exact priorities to the largest, likely most bipartisan audience she is going to have between now and election. The ratings for the DNC for the first 3 nights were hovering around the 20 million viewers mark, so this is as big as it gets. And that also might explain the tone of the entire night, to be honest. The DNC knew that this was their chance to beat back some of the attacks that had been levied at them and Harris by Trump and other Republicans as the party of radical liberals, so they used the night where they knew likely the most people would be watching to tune in to Harris to present her as the opposite of those things. She did end her speech, however, on a soaring note, and if there's a line in this speech that's going to get written into books of great American speeches, this is the one.
For this country we love, to fight for the ideals we cherish, and to uphold the awesome responsibility that comes with the greatest privilege on earth, the privilege and pride of being an American. Great chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told. Thank you.
It's absolutely a forward-looking vision, and it played right into the idea that Harris's candidacy is a new path and the start of a new era in American politics. There's one last thing I want to talk about, too, and that's the rumor that either Taylor Swift or Beyoncé were going to perform, more Beyoncé, because her song Freedom is the Harris campaign theme song. And then there was a tweet from a popular Twitter or X account that suggested it was Beyoncé, and the political director of the campaign tweeted out a bee emoji, and at the sound check, before doors opened, they were playing Beyoncé's music. All of that led to a lot of breathless, speculative coverage on the networks. In the end, Beyoncé did not perform, and the buildup of that, only to have it not happen, robbed the final night of a little bit of something, too. I can't help but think that the campaign allowed the rumor to spread, knowing that it would be distracting, but also knowing it might draw in viewers who would otherwise not tune in. So they rolled the dice a little bit, hoping the letdown wouldn't be so bad. All right, that was the final night of the DNC. Coming up next, my conversation with political science professor at Marquette University, a convention expert and contributor to the Good Politics, Bad Politics podcast and Substack, Julia Azari. Let's start with how are you watching the DNC right now? What are your takeaways? Obviously, it's Thursday. We haven't watched Kamala Harris speak yet, but the past 3 nights, what do you think so far?
So I guess I have kind of 2 thoughts. I think there's been a lot of good speakers, and there's been kind of a stark contrast with the RNC in that there's been a lot of featuring of kind of party rising stars, whereas the RNC, which I attended part of the RNC in person actually, was a lot of Trump's vanquished enemies, or vanquished rivals. And this is, this is a much more typical convention where you have, here's this person who's a representative, that, they featured AOC, who people have heard of, Jasmine Crockett, who maybe people have not. So that's one part of it. I think, there have been very strong reactions, positive reactions to the Obamas and to Tim Walz. On the other hand, it has been going real long.
Yeah.
And that's, I kind of feel like the vibe last night was like, we're going to exhaust you with our inclusiveness. We are going to hear from everybody, but it did have this sort of like open mic night feel at one point where it's like, here's Kamala Harris's nephew. And then I'm like, oh no, someone's going to do some spoken word poetry. Actually, Amanda Gorman did do spoken word poetry.
Amanda Gorman was there. Yeah.
Which was really good. But by the time they got around to her, my husband kind of turned to me and said, this would be more powerful if we hadn't heard like 50 million people before her.
Yeah. I got a sense too from last night, it being sort of the like national security and like, crime and law and order night too, that like that was the weakest night of issues for Democrats. So you could tell that like a lot of these things made a lot of delegates feel kind of squeamish or uncomfortable. And like, I think at one point the C-SPAN camera, because that was the feed I was watching, like cut to the Texas delegation during an immigration portion. And like a bunch of the Texans got up and left in the middle of that. And I don't know if that was just because they were like we have to go to the bathroom. Right. Or like they were like doing it on purpose. But like it did feel sort of like an open mic night in the way that it was like, we're just trying to make sure that everyone sticks around for this thing that we know we're not great at. Taking it from like a 50,000 foot view, do conventions even matter anymore? This one in particular is extremely ceremonial because she already accepted the nomination in the virtual call earlier this month. The networks don't really cover them in the same way they used to. So does this even matter apart from just a political party wants to throw a giant party?
So I think they matter in a couple ways. I mean, it's not just a party. The people there are actually doing some business and having caucus meetings and things. So when you're actually there, it seems like, things that are being done. I think there are two things. One is that there is some evidence that the convention is sort of when public opinion gets set and that candidates get a kind of more durable, typically get a more durable bump. Not that what public approval ratings or opinion looks like the week after the convention, that doesn't last, but some of it lasts. And I think that when it does, and I think part of the reason it's kind of going so long, the pacing is so off when you're watching it on TV. I've been watching the live YouTube feed, so I've been watching the whole thing. Is because they're trying to sort of generate as many good, positive social media clips and TikTok clips and PBS NewsHour clips as they can. Just to be sort of reshared either through conventional media or through more newer forms of media. And I think that's also why they're featuring so many different speakers, is just to give all those different groups an opportunity to articulate different types of positions.
I do want to talk a little bit about tone on this issue of what's dividing the different parties here. It seems so stark to me, the difference between the DNC and the RNC. I've seen cuts of this online and like on TikTok and stuff where like people bounce back and forth between the RNC, delegations casting their ballots or their votes versus what it was last night or 2 nights ago. For you, should that be a signal to party voters, regardless of which party they're in, about the health of their party?
So I think the big thing in Milwaukee was that they were coming off of an assassination attempt of Donald Trump, and they were also operating in a very different political context because they thought they were going to beat Joe Biden. And so I think that really shaped the tone. And walking around the convention, which I did for 2 nights, and I was in the hall for Trump's speech. I don't really remember the roll call, actually. The tone there was very much, there was a lot of talk about Trump being kind of chosen by God. There was a lot of religious talk. There was a lot of talk about a lot of negativity about Biden and the Biden administration. There's a lot of gender talk that sort of teases some of the issues that now seem to be kind of, hitting the party back. Maybe they've overstepped a little bit. There was a very different tone in that way. And that all makes sense. And I'm sure trying to strike the right tone after an assassination attempt is very tricky, of course. So I think it's a little bit, it's just been such a weird year. is really the point that I would take away. But one of the things that I look at conventions is how do they strike the balance between president and party? So on the one hand, it is the president's day, right? The presidential candidate. It is,
Sure.
That is the purpose, is to bring everybody together behind the presidential candidate, introduce them to the country. At the same time, it's also a party convention, and the party plays a role in that as well. And just as the party is kind of celebrating their candidate, the candidate is then supposed to sort of reflect that back at the party and celebrate the people who have brought them to the nominations, celebrate all the different, and try, to find common ground across all different factions of the party. I think that's been kind of in evidence with Harris. It's very much been a party event. With Trump, that was very striking. There were very few rising stars. There were a lot of Trump family members prominently featured, including the daughter-in-law is the co-chair of the RNC, and like I said, a lot of Trump's rivals endorsing Trump, and he's had a lot of rivals. He's run twice in a really crowded field, and also then kind of the silences of who was not there doing that endorsing, like Pence, for example. But that it very much felt like a Trump event being on the ground in Milwaukee. I'm not on the ground in Chicago, and certainly Harris is the focal point, but it still feels a lot more kind of expansive. I think that's to some degree reflects enduring party differences, but also reflects the phenomenon that is Trumpism. And that's really, as I would sort of direct people to think about how to analyze how the two parties are operating right now, that's what I would direct their attention toward.
How do you think the Democrats did at balancing the idea between, in your, idea of this, that like these conventions are about balancing president and party, the Democrats this year had to balance president, and party kind of a thing. And so how do you think the Democrats did in balancing the send-off of Joe Biden while also keeping this thing focused on electing Kamala Harris and Tim Walz? How do you think they've done so far?
I think that they've done all right. Biden isn't the kind of figure who sort of looms over the whole convention. I think that's maybe part of why he is in kind of the situation he's in. He's a party guy. And he's always been, his administration has always been kind of a collective. One of the early things that he did was talk about appointing a woman as vice president. And then that kind of shifted and broadened out to appointing women of color. So Biden, we've seen a lot of attention to people talking about Biden's, thanking him for his service. We've had the sort of thank you, Joe chants, but it doesn't feel like he's lurking over the proceedings. The sort of point of contrast, and I'm kind of thinking about this, some of the moments when Hillary Clinton was campaigning, more in 2007 than in 2016. But, Bill Clinton is a very large figure and kind of figured very prominently. And I remember kind of thinking, if she's the nominee and then if she wins, Bill Clinton is just going to be this traveling circus. And Biden isn't really like that.
For your money, who has been the best speech so far? I know that I have mine, but I want to hear what you think first.
So I think I'm hearing a lot about Michelle Obama, and I thought her speech was amazing. But I think actually the one that has stayed with me the most was Raphael Warnock's on Monday night. I thought that Raphael Warnock actually said some things in some new ways, which for me just kind of blew me away at a convention that someone is saying something thought-provoking, because usually it's not it's not like that. And I also thought that Warnock did some important things, not just in terms of kind of taking a religious message back from where it's traditionally been. The Republicans kind of owned that issue of religion in public life, but also he talked about, he came up with some frameworks for some of the more difficult issues for Democrats to face. So he talked about Gaza a little bit. He talked about in terms of everyone having kind of a stake in each other's well-being. And he also talked about COVID, which is something that I think is a kind of challenging piece of the party's history to address, and an issue that divides internally, again, between people who might have liked to see more kind of stringent action from the Biden administration versus people who are sort of over it, wanted their kids to go back to school. I think that's, we don't talk about it as much anymore, But I think that some of that is still lingering, and I think that probably nationally we haven't really processed all of what happened 4 years ago. And so I thought those were the elements of Warnock's speech that were very compelling, in addition to, of course, his very practice delivery as a pastor.
Yeah, I think for me it was Doug Emhoff. I have been the most I was the most surprised by, and I think in terms of helping a Harris campaign was the most helpful and the most politically effective in that way. I was surprised at the sincerity. I was surprised at his geniality. I was sort of taken with this like love story in a way that he was explaining, but also in the fact that like he really did his job in humanizing Harris, I thought, in a way that she's not done, and whether that's just because of the speed of this campaign, because it's unprecedented and like dizzying, but also she's sort of taken a line as a bio page for her career as a prosecutor and a progressive, but we don't know her in this other space. And while the prosecutor and progressive thing are still part of her character, I thought Doug Emhoff did a really good job of being like, this is who she is. And when you're talking about somebody who's going to be in the Oval Office, I think he did a really good job of showing like, hey, this is how she approaches big life decisions. This is how she approaches crises big and small. This is how she starts looking at a problem in the way that Emhoff described it as like a, how do I put this? The way that he described it as starting people first in solving a problem and keeping people in mind, which like, obviously this was, he wasn't doing this off the cuff. So this was written for him and everything. And, he's a lawyer by trade. So he's going to be probably pretty good at speaking to a crowd this big. Speaking to a national audience is a different thing than, being able to get in front of a room. But I think in just terms of being surprised at what I heard, it was, for me, it was Doug Emhoff.
Makes a lot of sense. And that's typically the role that the first, the potential first spouse plays, is this sort of telling you who this person is, kind of humanizing them. And that has a new level with the first, the potential first gentleman. Yeah. And, again, going back to Hillary and Bill Clinton, those dynamics were quite different.
Yes.
So this is the first situation like that where it's a little bit more normal, where like, who is this person, and then who is their spouse, and I think that Emhoff has really been a master of the gender dynamics of that. He's really been a master of sort of stepping into a typical political state spouse role and bringing masculinity to it in a way that has subverted some problematic expectations, and at the same time sort of made it new. And I have to say, I was watching this with my husband. At first I'm like, why is he going on? It's too much talking. And he started telling the story about calling Harris at 8:30 in the morning, and my husband was just completely cracking up. I think maybe he was the demographic for that. And he usually doesn't watch this stuff with me. He's usually, like, oh, good, you're going to be on the internet being snarky up in the other room.
Right. I mean, I think selfishly too, the Doug Emhoff thing is like, I was like watching that thing and I was like, oh, this is for me, like as a wife guy or whatever, right? It was like, oh, this is, I also, in a sense, I said this in one of the mini episodes of this podcast this week, that like, it's such a stark contrast too between like what the Democrats see as pro-family and what the Republicans see as pro-family. And if you're going to juxtaposition anything, it's Doug Emhoff and J.D. Vance, and how they approach their relationships and how they approach their marriages, and thus like, by allowing these things to be public, how the parties approach families and approach the American family. And so like, I think from a broader political aspect too, the Doug Emhoff speech was a really interesting sort of like workaround hook at J.D. Vance and the stuff that he's been doing. And I don't know if they necessarily understand that yet. I'm sure there are people in the party who do at this point, but they've not latched onto that. And I haven't seen anybody talk about that yet either. And I know I said last question on the last question, but my actual last question is, what are you looking for after the convention here? Is it just, keeping momentum going for Harris and Walz? And I've likened it to sort of like a booster engine on a rocket where like they've kind of stalled and now this thing happens. Or is there something else you're looking for? So what are you watching?
I mean, I think pretty much that. I think I'll be sort of looking at the polls. The polls have been very complicated because we've had a lot of events that, happen while someone's poll is in the field kind of situation. I'll be looking at that. I'll be looking at how, whether different pieces of this that, what different pieces get picked up in the media. That's always interesting to me. Like, I'm thinking about Michelle Obama's line from 2016 about when we go low, they go low, we go high. That was controversial at the time and it's controversial now, but I don't know if anyone anticipated that would be one of the sort of breakaway lines necessarily. And so I'm curious about what will be the breakaway lines. And I was in the West Dallas gym when Harris came here right after her candidacy was announced. And I saw the thing where she said, "We're not going back," and people started chanting it kind of spontaneously. And so I'm also looking at what else will sort of come out of this convention as far as some of the kind of key lines and key ideas.
Well, Julia, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Okay, that's it for this week's Make It Make Sense main episode. Thank you again to Julia for coming on the show. I'll have an extended interview with her on the Make It Make Sense substack tomorrow, so subscribe now if you haven't already to hear more from her and some of the previous guests I've had on the show, and also more from me. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it, and like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also follow and share the show on social media at MIMS Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod. It's all one word on every platform. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll be back for another MIMS mini episode tomorrow.